Yeah, thank you, Christoph, also for these very nice words for the introduction and on our project. Really thank you all for coming from far and near. And in particular, I want to thank the participants from Ukraine who maybe had the most difficult journey physically and also mentally, because since Russia started its aggression against Ukraine, it is very difficult to think about academia and scholarly discussions when you first have to think about protecting your life and the life of your families. So I'm particularly happy that so many made it here and that we can still with this conference contribute to keeping our scholarly contacts with Ukraine running. So thank you for this. I, of course, also want to give a warm welcome to the three members of our academic advisory board that Christoph just mentioned. I see David, Sabine, I saw yesterday, and Peter will come later because he had another commitment there. They were with us for the last 4.5 years, and they supported us with advice, and now they are here to discuss with us. I also want to welcome Andreas Kappeler, with whom I had the chance to chat, because Andreas Kappeler was one of those historians who started being interested in the Ukrainian history when in the 1980s nobody was interested in Ukrainian history, and he wrote a seminal book not only on Ukrainian history but also on Imperial Russia as a multinational empire, which very much fits our discussions today. And then, of course, thank you. My dearest thanks go to the entire Anti-Autonomy team for conceptualizing and organizing this conference. I want to name them because you see them in the program anyway, but Timo Ava, Anna Adoyani, Matthias Battis, Oskar Mulej, and Yuki Morata. And in particular, I want to thank Marina Germane, who is this conference's scholarly coordinator, and you all were in contact with her. And the other very important person is Sylvia Steiner, who is our project manager and the manager for this conference as well. And you all were in contact with her, and she will not give you rest. She will come to some of you again during this conference with additional questions, additional signatures. So don't be surprised. Sylvia is always with us. And then, of course, I also want to thank Agathe Formanek and Hanna Steckelberg, our research interns, who supported this conference in so many ways before the conference started, while we are here. So thank you to both of you. And then, of course, the technical support. And then a very formal thing, I have to thank the Cost Action, the European Non-Territorial Autonomy Network that is... Oh, I think we have a problem here. Is it better? That is co-funding this conference. This is actually, and they want us to record all our presentations because they want to make a great performance video. So don't be surprised that this will happen as well. As Christoph mentioned already, this is our project slowly comes to an end, and this is our concluding conference of this project, Non-Territorial Autonomy, History of a Traveling Idea, which was an intellectual dream for me, with all the discussions and the things that I was able to learn within our group. We are a group of 7 academics, and actually we almost were more because we always had guest researchers and research interns, and we had a lot of lively discussions. And if you ask what was the overarching aim of this project, this was to bring out the importance of non-territorial autonomy in the way European states approach their own national diversity. We pursued this endeavor by focusing on three main research fields. First, we looked on the origins and the early development of non-territorial autonomy in the multinational Habsburg and Romanov Empire. Then we looked, a second focus was on the interpretation of non-territorial autonomy across the ideological spectrum during the interwar period. And thirdly, we studied non-territorial autonomy in the international arena of minority protection. We certainly investigated all these case studies in their own end, and this was good. But as a team, we were particularly interested in the circulation, in the interrelations and transfer and translations of non-territorial autonomy in different parts of Europe in different periods of time. Our project wanted to marry a history of ideas approach and a political history slant. So we wanted to study both. So how the concept evolved as an idea and how the idea was implemented over time. And when we studied such implemented non-territorial autonomy regulations, we sometimes saw fully fledged NTA legislations like in the Ukrainian People's Republic or in interwar Estonia, but more often we found non-territorial arrangements that came in combination with territorial forms of self-rule. And sometimes these arrangements were concealed, sometimes they were open, but this makes it very interesting to look at them. I think that our overall research results are very rich. I'm very happy that most of our original hypotheses could be confirmed. But in addition, there were some results that were beyond my expectations, and I was astonished myself when working on this topic, what came out, and I want to sketch some of them here, these extraordinary or these unexpected things. When it comes to the Habsburg Empire, I was astonished how big the differences were between the Austrian part of the empire and the Hungarian part. Whereas in Hungary, very few people, well, they might have known about it, but it was not prominent in the intellectual discourse, whereas it was omnipresent in Austria's state reform discourse, both in the applied policies, like in the provincial compromises, but also in its Austro-Marxist considerations. And I think that actually Karl Renner, the big author of non-territorial autonomy, he was very whining when he always complained that nobody listened to him and that nobody reads him and that and certainly not the bourgeoisie. That's not right. Everybody knew about it. There were a lot of people who disagreed with him, but the idea was very well known. What I find maybe even more striking from this project was how much homegrown non-territorial autonomy was in Imperial Russia. There were decade-long discussions on decentralization, federalization, other non-territorial arrangements that prepared the ground for Russian intellectuals to look beyond the borders and observe, adapt, and adopt Austro-Marxist ideas. And of course, with Russian intellectuals, I mean in the sense of Rossiyski, so because many of these intellectuals were actually Jews or Poles, not so much Poles, but Ukrainians and Jews. And adding to this, I think whereas many scholars who deal a bit with non-territorial autonomy, they knew the names of Simon Dubnov and the importance of the Jewish Workers' Bund, but we found that the Jewish Socialist Workers' Party, the Serb party, was equally important because the Serb was so close to the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party was, before the revolution, was the strongest, maybe the most influential socialist political force. And the socialist revolutionaries ended up in advocating a combination of territorial and non-territorial autonomy. And I was equally astonished how ubiquitous this combination, so between territorial and non-territorial autonomy, was in the period, in the year 1917, so in the period between the February Revolution and the Bolshevik coup d'etat. So this is something I learned from there. And what is more, when we analyze non-territorial autonomy policies in the interwar period, in the Ukrainian People's Republic, the Baltic states, but also in international minority advocacy, actually as well, if we look at non-territorial autonomy claims today, there is very little Renner in them. There is much more Dubnov, Medem, Ratner, Silberfarb, Szydlowski. So these guys contributed far more to the actual practice of non-territorial autonomy than Renner with his system, because Renner understood, the system that Renner proposed was designed for the nations to being an intrinsic part of the state structure, whereas in the Russian version it was more these non-territorial institutions should be something that should be added to the state or in parallel. So if you wish, the Rennerian model was something more like organizing a multinational state in its entirety, whereas the second type, I call it the Russian model, was more for accommodating minorities in a multinational state, so not the reorganization of the state in itself. And actually, exactly this field of tension between multinationalism and minoritization was maybe the most interesting result of the research that was. I was closer involved, also Yuki, on the Ukrainian People's Republic. Of course, specialists knew before that Ukraine was the first country in the world that introduced non-territorial autonomy as a law. But the very fact, and this I find very interesting, the very fact that it was a policy for minorities was an intellectual turnaround. Because being a minority and demanding minority rights was something very logic for the Jewish community, and maybe also for the Poles. I mean, they were the socially dominant group, but they knew they were very little. But it was a complete reversal of perceptions and hierarchies for Russians and for the Russian parties. And so the very fact that you had a law on non-territorial autonomy for minorities automatically assigned the non-Ukrainians in a Ukrainian nation state the role of a minority position. And this change of hierarchies I found very interesting to observe. And there's a last astonishing result from this project that I would like to mention. I think we were able to confirm our hypothesis that non-territorial autonomy could be thought across the entire ideological spectrum. I think it comes with no surprise that it can be thought in a liberal or in a social democrat, socialist surrounding, because this is where this idea developed and where it was first implemented. It was, however, fascinating to see how many non-territorial arrangements were implemented in the early Soviet Union, despite the Bolsheviks so vigorously repudiated the very idea of non-territorial autonomy. And I was equally surprised how well the basic idea of non-territorial autonomy was translatable to the language of the far right. Non-territorial autonomy, as you all know, is a group rights approach, and therefore the way you define the national group plays a key role in any NTA regulation. And as the national community, in an almost völkisch understanding, was at the heart of the radical right Sudeten German party in the 1930s, this party could quite easily formulate its illiberal demands in an anti-Age language. And I found this also very interesting. And from all these premises, this conference today starts. And we strongly believe that non-territorial autonomy arrangements were thought and applied far more often in European history than one might think. So we invited you to discuss this together, and in particular, and Christoph mentioned it also already in his introduction, far too often the notions of the nation and territory are conceptualized as something intrinsically linked. Even in Central and Eastern Europe, where the term nation and state theoretically that's not a synonym, but still, even here, in this part of the world, a nation was and is rather understood as basically as a community of people who share a feeling of togetherness, whatever this is. Thus, theoretically, one could conclude that it's far more logic to apply the personality principle when we talk about nation and national rights than applying the territorial principle. But as you all know, most people would disagree, and they would make the link of territory and the nation. So why do so many people consider it counterintuitive to separate the nation from the state, similar to all these ideas of the Enlightenment to separate the state from the church? Is it because all administration and all rule requires a territory to be implemented? Is this the reason? But this would also apply for churches, of course, because a mosque or a church or a synagogue also has to be physically placed somewhere. Or is it because cultural things like schools and language are too intrinsically linked with our daily lives, so that you cannot split them off and let them being administered by another institution? But I think very religious people would also might make the same claim and say, no, religion is everywhere, so you can't split it off. Or is it because national movements have the tendency to always to radicalize, and first they demand cultural autonomy, so non-territorial autonomy, and then they go for territorial autonomy? What actually some activists did, and some state representatives feared. So is this true? Or is it the other way around, that also is an approach to non-territorial autonomy, that it basically always helps the center state, because weak or economically weak nationalities would always tend to align with the stronger nationality? Or is it because it is simply impossible to find an acceptable way to legally define national belonging, a way that does justice to both the individual and to the persistence of the national group? So you see, I started with so many questions here. We might not be able to answer all of them, but I can't wait discussing them with you. But before we start, before I cede the floor to the first panel, I have two more technical announcements. Due to foreign non-Austrian corona regulations, we had to swap two panels. Jeremy King and Trine Tag will now present in panel 4, which is tomorrow before lunch. You have the little paper in your program. And Andrea Pokludova and Gennady Korolyov will take their place in the panel 6 on Saturday. So thank you all for your flexibility on this. And the other thing is even more spontaneous. It arrived to us today in the morning. Ronny Gechtmann, his plane could not leave Canada, so he is not with us. And Pete Guman, who would talk on Saturday, will switch to panel 1 and be on the panel with Gabor Egri in the very first panel. And with this, I pass on to Anna Adorjani, our specialist on non-territorial autonomy in the Kingdom of Hungary, who will be the moderator and discussant of the first panel. And as you see, the group decided, the anti-autonomy decided not to present themselves, but to discuss and learn from you. Thank you.